Corbin Hayes sat at that poker table, thinking he was about to win cattle and land. Instead, he won a 17-year-old Chinese girl whose eyes held more fire than fear. The old rancher stared at the deed in his weathered hands. But it wasn't for property. It was for a human being. And in that moment, everything he thought he knew about winning and losing crumbled like dust. The smoky saloon had fallen silent, except for the crackling of the fireplace. 5 men around the worn wooden table, and Corbin held the winning hand. Aces over kings. He should have been celebrating. He should have been counting his money. But Jiang Wei, the Chinese trader, pushed forward a piece of paper instead of coins. "I got nothing left but this," Jiang said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My niece, she is a hard worker. She can cook. She can clean. She is worth more than any cattle." Corbin's throat went dry. He had come here to win enough money to buy breeding stock for his failing ranch. 3 years of drought had killed most of his herd, and at 45, he was running out of time to build something lasting. The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably, their chairs creaking against the wooden floor. "I don't want a girl," Corbin said, pushing the paper back across the table. "Keep your family," but Jiang's hands were shaking now. "Please, mister, I owe money to very dangerous men. They come tomorrow if I cannot pay." He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning hung in the air like smoke. The saloon door creaked open, and a young woman stepped inside. She moved with purpose, her dark hair pulled back in a simple, tight braid, her dress simple but clean despite the dust of travel. This had to be Lin Mai. She looked directly at Corbin, and he saw something unexpected in her dark, almond-shaped eyes. Not desperation or pleading, but a quiet strength that reminded him of wild horses just before they decided whether to run or fight. "Uncle," she said in careful English, "you do not need to do this." Jiang turned to her with tears building in his eyes. There is no other way. These men, they will hurt us both if I cannot pay what I owe." Corbin studied the girl's face. She understood exactly what was happening, but she wasn't crying or begging. She was calculating, thinking through options like a seasoned poker player. There was intelligence behind those eyes and something else he couldn't quite identify. The other men at the table were growing restless. "Either take the bet or fold, Hayes," growled Flannery, the saloon owner. "We ain't got all night." Corbin looked at his cards again. A winning hand that could change everything, but not in the way he had expected. When he sat down tonight, he thought about his empty ranch, his empty house, his empty life stretching ahead of him. No wife, no children, no legacy to leave behind. But something about this girl's steady gaze made him pause. She was watching him with the intensity of someone trying to read his character, not his intentions. And what she saw there would determine more than just tonight's outcome. "What exactly are you asking me to do with her?" Corbin asked quietly. Jiang's eyes darted nervously around the saloon before he leaned forward. "She is a good worker, sir. She will help you with your ranch, cook your meals, tend your animals. She is strong, not like other girls who cry and complain." His voice carried the desperation of a man with no other options. Corbin felt the weight of every eye in the room. The other players waited for his decision, some amused by the unusual stakes, others clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. Flannery drummed his thick fingers on the table, eager to see how this would play out. "I run cattle, not a boarding house for young women," Corbin said firmly. "What you're suggesting ain't proper." "Then find her a husband," Jiang pressed. "She is 17, old enough to marry. A good husband who will treat her well. Just keep her safe until then." Lin Mai stepped closer to the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I can speak for myself, Uncle." She turned to Corbin, and he was struck again by her composure. "Sir, I understand this is not what you wanted to win tonight, but my uncle speaks the truth about the dangerous men. They will be here tomorrow, and they will not be patient." Dalton studied her face carefully. There was fear there, but it was controlled, practical. She wasn't begging him to save her. She was presenting him with facts, letting him make his own choice. "These men your uncle owes money to," Corbin said slowly. "What kind of debt are we talking about?" Jiang's shoulders sagged. Gambling debts and other things. I tried to help some families pay for their passage from the old country. I borrowed money to pay for the journey, but the families, they never arrived. The money was lost, but the debt remains. The picture was becoming clearer now. Jiang wasn't just a gambler who had gotten in over his head. He was a man who had tried to help others and paid the price for it. That changed things, though Corbin wasn't sure why it should matter to him. How much does he owe? Corbin asked. $300, Jiang whispered. The saloon fell completely silent. $300 was more money than most men saw in 2 years. It was enough to buy a good horse and saddle or seed for an entire season's crop. Corbin looked at his winning hand again, then at the girl standing beside the table. Lin Mai was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Not hope exactly, but something more complex. She was measuring him, trying to determine what kind of man he was, whether he would treat her with dignity or see her as property to be traded. You got any other family? Corbin asked her directly. No, sir, just my uncle. My parents died 3 years ago. The simple statement hit him harder than he expected. An orphan, just like he had been. No family to protect her. No one to ensure she was treated fairly. If he walked away from this table tonight, what would happen to her? But taking responsibility for another person's life wasn't something he had planned for, and certainly not like this. Corbin set his cards face down on the table and looked directly at Lin Mai. You understand what's being proposed here? Your uncle wants to sign over your care to a complete stranger. For all you know, I could be worse than the men he owes money to. Something flickered in her eyes. Are you worse than them, sir? The question caught him off guard. She was turning the tables, interviewing him instead of pleading with him. I reckon that's something you'd have to decide for yourself. Then let me ask you something, Lin Mai said, her voice steady. Do you have children of your own? The question hit like a physical blow. Corbin's jaw tightened and he felt the familiar ache in his chest that came whenever anyone mentioned children. No, I don't. Because you choose not to, or because you cannot. Flanny shifted uncomfortably. Girl, that ain't none of your business, but Corbin held up a hand to silence him. This young woman was asking the hard questions, the ones that mattered. Because I cannot, he said quietly. My wife and I tried for years before she died. Never happened. Lin Mai nodded slowly, as if this information confirmed something she had been thinking. Then you understand what it means to want something you cannot have, to feel like your life has no purpose. The words stung because they were true. Since Abigail's death 5 years ago, Corbin had been going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. The ranch kept him busy, but it didn't give him joy. He worked because work was what you did, not because he was building toward anything meaningful. What's your point? He asked. My point is that maybe we both need something different than what we planned, Lin Mai said. You need help with your ranch. I need protection from dangerous men. Maybe this arrangement could benefit both of us. Jiang was watching this exchange with growing hope, but also with obvious surprise. His niece was negotiating her own future with the confidence of someone twice her age. Corbin found himself genuinely curious about this girl. You ever worked on a ranch before? Yes, sir. My family raised ducks and chickens. I know how to tend sick animals. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I can also read and write in both Chinese and English. And you're willing to do all that for a man you just met? She was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. I am willing to work hard for someone who treats me with respect. Someone who sees me as a person, not as property. There it was, the real negotiation. She wasn't just asking for safety. She was asking for dignity. And somehow, she had correctly guessed that Corbin might be the kind of man who would understand the difference. What happens when you turn 18? Corbin asked. You'll be free to leave, find a husband, start your own life. I won't have any claim on you then. That is true, she agreed. But until then, you would have someone to help make your ranch profitable again, and I would have time to learn about this country, to decide what kind of life I want to build here." Corbin looked around the table at the other men. They were all watching this unusual negotiation with fascination. A girl was essentially interviewing her potential guardian, setting terms for her own care. Flannery cleared his throat. "Hayes, you going to play this hand or not? Dawn's going to come whether you make a decision or not." But as Corbin looked at Lin Mai's determined face, he realized the decision had already been made. Not by him, but by something larger than his own plans and expectations. Corbin reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He counted out $300 in bills, more money than he had planned to spend tonight. Money he had been saving for breeding cattle. The other men at the table watched in stunned silence as he placed the bills in front of Jiang. "I'm not taking ownership of your niece," Corbin said firmly. "But I'll pay your debt. She can come work for me, earn her keep, and when she's ready to move on, she's free to go." Jiang stared at the money with tears streaming down his face. "Sir, I cannot repay you for this kindness." "I'm not doing it for you," Corbin said bluntly. "I'm doing it because no person should be treated like livestock." He turned to Lin Mai. "You understand the arrangement? You work for me. I provide food and shelter. When you want to leave, you leave. No strings attached." Lin Mai picked up the deed her uncle had been prepared to sign and slowly tore it in half. "I understand, sir, and I accept your offer." Flannery gathered up the cards and began shuffling them again. "Well, that's the strangest poker game I ever witnessed. Hayes, you just paid $300 for a hired hand you could have gotten for free." "Maybe," Corbin said, standing up from the table. "But at least now we both know where we stand." As they walked toward the saloon door, Lin Mai touched his arm lightly. "Mr. Hayes," she began, then hesitated. "Corbin, may I ask you something?" He paused. "Yes." "Why did you really do this? You could have walked away." Corbin paused with his hand on the door handle. How could he explain that watching her stand up for herself with such dignity had reminded him of Abigail? Or that something about her quiet strength made him feel less alone than he had in years? "Because," he said finally, "sometimes doing the right thing is the only choice that lets you sleep at night." Outside, the night air was crisp and clear. Lin Mai's small bag was tied to her uncle's horse, and Jiang was preparing to leave town immediately. The men he owed money to would be looking for him at dawn, and he needed to be far away by then. "Mai," Jiang said, embracing his niece tightly. "You are braver than I ever was. Make a good life here." "I will, uncle." "Stay safe." Corbin watched this goodbye with an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. These two were all the family each other had. And now they were separating, possibly forever. He thought about his own family, dead and buried years ago, and realized he couldn't remember the last time he had said goodbye to someone who mattered to him. Jiang mounted his horse and rode out of town without looking back. Lin Mai stood in the dusty street, watching until his silhouette disappeared into the darkness. When she turned back to Corbin, her eyes were dry, but he could see the effort it was taking to keep them that way. "So," she said quietly, "what happens now?" Corbin looked at this young woman who had just watched her only family disappear into the night, and he realized he had no idea what happened next. He had just taken responsibility for another person's life, and he wasn't sure he was capable of taking care of himself, let alone someone else. The ride to Corbin's ranch took nearly 2 hours through rough terrain under a canopy of stars. Lin Mai rode behind him on his horse, and neither of them spoke much during the journey, but Corbin found himself acutely aware of her presence. The way she sat straight in the saddle despite her exhaustion, the way she observed everything around them without asking questions. When they finally reached his property, Corbin felt a familiar stab of embarrassment. The ranch looked worse at night than it did during the day. But even in the darkness, the signs of neglect were obvious: fences that needed mending, a barn door hanging crooked on its hinges, weeds growing where there should have been crops. "It's not much," he said as they approached the main house. "It has good bones," Lin Mai replied, studying the structure. Sometimes that is enough to build on. Inside, Corbin lit a lamp and looked around his home through fresh eyes. When Abigail was alive, this place had been warm and welcoming. Now it looked like what it was, the dwelling of a man who had stopped caring about comfort or appearances. Dust covered most surfaces, dishes sat unwashed in the basin, and clothes were scattered across chairs. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," Linmai said, taking in the scene without judgment. "Tomorrow I can start cleaning." "You'll sleep in the spare room," Corbin said firmly. "It's not fancy, but it's got a rail bed and a window." He led her down a short hallway to a small room that had once been intended for the children he and Abigail never had. The bed was narrow but clean, and there was a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. Linmai set her small bag on the floor and turned to face him. "Mr. Hayes, I want to be clear about something. I am grateful for what you did tonight, but I do not want you to think that I owe you anything beyond honest work." Her directness caught him off guard again. "I wouldn't expect anything else." "Good. Because I have seen what happens to girls in my situation when men think they are owed more than work." She met his eyes steadily. "I would rather take my chances with those dangerous men than live that way." Corbin felt heat rise in his face. "I'm not that kind of man." "I believe you," she said simply. "But I wanted to say it clearly so there would be no misunderstanding later." He nodded, suddenly feeling awkward in his own home. "There's well water outside for washing. Breakfast is usually at sunrise, but I can cook for myself if you need time to settle in." "I will cook breakfast," Linmai said. "What do you normally eat?" "Whatever's available. Beans, bacon, if I have it. Bread when I remember to bake it." She wrinkled her nose slightly. "That is not a diet for a working man. Tomorrow I will see what you have and make something proper." After he left her to settle in, Corbin sat on his front porch and tried to process what had just happened. A few hours ago, he had been a solitary rancher with no prospects and no purpose beyond basic survival. Now he had a 17-year-old Chinese girl living in his house, a girl who spoke with the confidence of someone much older and who had somehow managed to negotiate her own terms of employment. The strangest part was that for the first time in years, his house didn't feel completely empty. There was someone else breathing within these walls, someone who might actually make the place feel like a home again instead of just a shelter. But as he sat there in the darkness, Corbin couldn't shake the feeling that Linmai was hiding something important. Something about the way she had handled herself tonight, the questions she had asked, the calm way she had assessed him and his character. This was not an ordinary 17-year-old girl. And whatever her real story was, he had a feeling he was about to discover that taking her in was going to change more than just his daily routine. Corbin woke before dawn to the smell of something he hadn't experienced in his kitchen for 5 years, fresh bread baking. He dressed quickly and walked toward the main room, where he found Linmai already busy preparing what looked like a feast compared to his usual morning meal of cold beans and coffee. "Good morning," she said without turning around. "I found flour and eggs in your pantry. The bread will be ready soon." "You didn't have to get up this early," Corbin said, pouring himself coffee from a pot that was somehow better than anything he had ever managed to brew. "I always rise early. It is the best time to think clearly." She turned to face him, and he noticed she had somehow managed to make herself look completely refreshed despite having only a few hours of sleep. "I have been thinking about your ranch." "What about it?" She gestured toward the window where the first light of dawn was revealing the extent of his property. "You have good land, good water access, but you are not using it efficiently. Why do you raise only cattle?" Corbin sat down at his kitchen table, which was cleaner than it had been in months. "Cattle is what I know, what my father knew before me. But cattle need much grass, much water. In a drought, they die. You need diversity." She brought him a plate of eggs and fresh bread that made his mouth water. "Chickens lay eggs even in dry weather. Goats give milk and can eat weeds that cattle will not touch. A garden provides food even when money is scarce." He took a bite of the bread and nearly groaned with pleasure. It was the best thing he had tasted in years. "You learned all this raising ducks with your family?" Something shifted in her expression just for a moment. Yes, among other things there was that feeling again, the sense that she was holding something back. But before he could pursue it, she continued with her assessment of his ranch. Your fences need repair, but the posts are solid. Your barn needs attention, but the foundation is strong. You have been maintaining just enough to keep things from falling apart completely, but not enough to make them thrive. Her observations were uncomfortably accurate. Since Abigail's death, he had indeed been doing the minimum necessary to survive, nothing more. I suppose you have ideas about how to fix all that. I have many ideas. But first, I need to understand why you have given up. The directness of the question took his breath away. I haven't given up. Have you not? She sat down across from him with her own plate. You have good land, enough money to pay a stranger's debt, and clearly you know how to work hard. But you live like a man waiting to die. Corbin set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone. My wife and I had plans. Big plans. We were going to build something lasting, something to pass on to our children. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. When she died, and when it became clear there would never be children. So you decided that without children, there was no point in building anything. What's the point of building something if there's no one to inherit it? Lin Mai was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. May I tell you something about my parents? He nodded, curious to learn more about her background. They never owned land. They worked other people's farms their entire lives. But they taught me that building something good is worthwhile, even if it does not last forever. They said the purpose of creating something beautiful is not to preserve it for eternity, but to prove that beauty is possible. The words hit him harder than he expected. He looked around his kitchen, seeing it through her eyes, neglected, joyless, maintained, but not loved. But something in the way she had spoken about her parents made him suspect there was more to their story than she was revealing. After breakfast, Corbin took Lin Mai on a tour of the property so she could see the full extent of what they were working with. As they walked, she asked detailed questions about water sources, soil quality, and seasonal weather patterns. Her knowledge was impressive, but there was something else in the way she observed everything, a calculating intelligence that seemed beyond her years. This area would be perfect for vegetables, she said, pointing to a flat section near the house. Good drainage, morning sun, protected from strong winds. You really think you can make a difference here? Corbin asked. I think we can make a difference here if you are willing to try something new. The word "weed" stopped him in his tracks. No one had included him in future plans for a long time. Why do you care? You could find work in town, marry some young man, start your own family. Why waste time trying to fix an old rancher's broken dreams? Lin Mai stopped walking and turned to face him directly. Because I understand what it means to lose everything and have to start over. Your parents' death. She was quiet for a long moment, and Corbin could see her wrestling with how much to reveal. My parents did not just die, Mr. Hayes. They were killed. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Corbin felt his chest tighten. Killed how? By men who wanted our land. We had a small farm, a claim we worked hard for. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. Some wealthy ranchers decided they wanted our plot, our access to the creek. Her voice remained steady, but her hands clenched into fists. When my father refused to sell, they made it look like an accident. A fire that spread too quickly for anyone to escape. Dalton stared at her, beginning to understand the steel he had seen in her eyes from the first moment they met. You were there. I was visiting my aunt in the next town. When I came home, she took a deep breath. There was nothing left. No house, no parents, no proof of what really happened. The authorities said it was tragic but not suspicious. And my uncle Jiang, he tried to help me fight for justice, but we had no money for lawyers, no influence. The men who killed my parents were powerful, respected. We were just poor Chinese farmers. She looked out across Corbin's land. That is when my uncle started gambling, trying to win enough money to hire lawyers. Instead, he lost everything and ended up in debt to dangerous men. The pieces were falling into place now. This wasn't just a girl who needed protection from her uncle's creditors. This was someone who had already lost everything once and was determined never to be powerless again. Is that why you're really here? Corbin asked. To learn how to build something that can't be taken away. Partly, she met his eyes. But also because I recognize something in you that I see in myself. You have given up not because you lack the ability to build something great, but because you are afraid of losing it again. Her insight was uncomfortable in its accuracy. Maybe I have good reason to be afraid. Maybe you do. But fear is not a good reason to waste a life. They stood there in the morning sunlight, two people who had both been broken by loss, looking at land that could either represent a new beginning or just another disappointment. Corbin found himself wondering if this young woman might be right, if it was possible to build something meaningful even without the guarantee of permanence. If we do this, he said slowly, if we try to make this place thrive again, what happens when you're ready to move on? When you find someone to marry or decide to start your own farm? Lin Mai smiled for the first time since he had met her, and it transformed her entire face. Then you will have proven that you can build something beautiful, and maybe you will have the confidence to keep building even after I'm gone. But as they walked back toward the house, Corbin couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something she wasn't telling him. Something about her parents' death or her uncle's debts or her own plans for the future. Whatever it was, he sensed it would change everything when it finally came to light. 3 weeks later, Corbin could barely recognize his own property. Under Lin Mai's guidance, they had repaired fences, cleaned the barn, planted a vegetable garden, and even acquired a small flock of chickens. The ranch was beginning to feel alive again in a way it hadn't since Abigail's death. But it was more than the physical improvements. For the first time in years, Corbin had a reason to get up each morning beyond mere survival. Lin Mai worked alongside him with an energy and purpose that was contagious, and her presence had filled the empty spaces in his house with conversation, laughter, and the simple comfort of not being alone. That afternoon, as they were mending a section of corral fence, a rider approached from the direction of town. Corbin recognized him as Sheriff Thompson and felt his stomach tighten with worry. "Afternoon, Corbin," Thompson said, dismounting from his horse. "Mind if we talk?" "What's this about, Sheriff?" Thompson glanced at Lin Mai, who had stopped working but remained close enough to hear the conversation. "Been some men in town asking questions about a Chinese girl. Said she might be traveling with an older relative, possibly her uncle." Corbin felt Lin Mai stiffen beside him, though she didn't speak. "What kind of men?" "The kind that make people nervous. Well-dressed, well-armed, asking questions in a way that didn't leave much room for refusing to answer." Thompson adjusted his hat. "They seemed particularly interested in anyone who might have won something valuable in a poker game recently." The implications were clear. The men Jiang owed money to had tracked his movements to the saloon and were now looking for both him and Lin Mai. But something about Thompson's tone suggested there was more to the story. "Sheriff,